Welcome to this week's lecture. Today we turn our attention to the environmental system, which is one of the three pillars of sustainability. Environmental problems such as climate change are central to the future of humanity. The global environmental problems that have developed since the Industrial Revolution have implications for humanity and for other species on planet Earth. The extent of such global environmental change as a consequence of human activities is so pervasive that in recent years, a new term has been coined to describe the extent and the duration of such impacts, the Anthropocene. That's why you sometimes hear climate change referred to as being anthropogenic climate change because of the human-induced nature of it. The term Anthropocene therefore refers to a new era where humans have become the dominant driver of change to the Earth's systems. So profound are human impacts on nature that the notion that of what we consider to be safe planetary boundaries for human activity is now the subject of serious scientific discussion. So this is what we hope you will learn by the end of this topic. Firstly, we'd like you to be able to discuss and compare and contrast concepts of sustainability versus environmentalism. Based on your prescribed reading for this week, we'd also like you to be able to understand and describe the 10 major natural environmental issues. Also get you to understand what is meant by NIMBY and its impact on environmental problems. And finally, of course, get you to understand the role that businesses and governments play in environmental issues. So we hope you enjoy the week, or this topic rather, and learn a lot. So for the first topic, ILO, let's think about the concept of sustainability and see how it compares to environmentalism. There's no single and universal definition of the natural environment. However, it's widely understood as nature, natural habitat, or the part of the earth that has not been built or formed by humans. Alternatively, Parkin describes the natural environment as the biophysical limits of life on planet Earth. For example, soil, airs, oceans, and ecological systems upon which the social and economic dimensions of such life depend. Parkin argues that such limits are resources or natural capital that is available for the progress of humans and other species. So comparing and contrasting these three different perspectives presented here highlights firstly, of course, that there is no common definition, but also interesting perspectives on what we mean by the natural environment. Yet another perspective of the natural environment stem from sort of deeper, more philosophical understandings of nature, such as deep ecology, and these tend to reject a human-centered view of nature. Schultz, for example, argues that nature can be viewed as everything other than humankind. Yet we know that humans have an inextricable link with nature. Schultz notes also that we humans sometimes forget that we have this link with nature and we are also actually part of nature. And we also know that humans rely on nature for food, shelter, and the raw materials for everything, or most things that we make at least. Now, tied to the understandings of the natural environment is the concept of sustainability. Otherwise, as you know in the subject, we also call it sustainable development. So whilst indigenous peoples' knowledge of the human impacts on the environment date back centuries, the origins of the sustainability, sustainable development concepts can be traced back to at least the 1960s with the emergence of the environmental movement. This movement was concerned with the sustainability of humanity's consumption of natural resources. So in a way, sustainability evolved from environmentalism, even though it did exist in its own form. If we're talking about conceptual evolution here. So the environmental movement really gained the impetus in the 1960s, as I mentioned, with the work of prominent environmentalists like Rachel Carson, whose seminal book called Silent Spring drew attention to the environmental impacts of the global chemical industry. Other milestones in the development of the environmental movement include the Club of Rome conference that resulted in a book called Limits to Growth by Meadows, Goldsmith, and Meadows in 1972. And that, we'll talk about limits to growth a bit later, but that essentially articulated the boundaries of human consumption and natural resources. This idea that we live in a world with finite resources, and we are going to, and have in some cases already hit limits to growth. And that growth is basically can't be infinite in a finite world. So rather than listening to me talk about it, I'd like you to watch this brief video called The Origins of the Environmental Movement for an introduction to the movement.
We began to see more and more environmental problems around the globe in the 50s and 60s and going into the 70s. As there was economic growth in countries all around the world, people were taking natural resources and transforming those resources into products that they wanted. And in the process of transforming trees into furniture and homes and so on, you cut down forests. In the process of creating energy, you burn coal to generate electricity, and you put pollutants into the sky. It was commonly believed that the only way to protect the environment was to have the government step in and make up for the mistakes of the marketplace, what was considered market failure. And it was interesting in this period of time, almost every economics book that dealt with environmental issues was under the impression that the source of environmental degradation, environmental problems in the world, was basically the profit system. That people and businessmen and corporations and their desire to make profits at the lowest possible cost to themselves, they would create pollutants and then they would dump these pollutants into the skies, into the rivers and so on. The opposite side of that, the flip side of that, was that it was believed that because markets were characterized by pollution, what were called negative externalities, the solution to this may well lie in the Soviet countries, because it was assumed that in the Soviet countries that industry is run for the good of all the people, good for the nation, and that you would look into these Soviet countries and you would find very little pollution. You would find sort of an environmental heaven. In the 70s, people began to look behind the Iron Curtain and they were horrified. Economist after economist saw that there were some of the worst environmental problems on the planet, that there were far worse problems than they had in the United States or in Western Europe. And that was sort of a perplexing problem for a lot of people. And you tie that in the same period, in the late 60s, you had large numbers of students around the world, young people, who decided that they wanted to protect the planet. It became very, very, very fashionable. Student revolution with the student uprising and so on in the late 60s, the anti-war movement, the hundreds of thousands of students that were marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., they were all carrying their red flags, and they had Chairman Mao's little red book. And they knew that capitalism was evil, it was destroying the planet, and we had to get rid of capitalism. And not too long after that, the war in Vietnam ended. But it was interesting that all these young kids then, who had sort of been radicalized and were sort of anti-free market, anti-capitalism, anti-profit system, anti-private property rights, kept on marching. Except what they did, they switched their Bible. Instead of holding up Chairman Mao's little red book, they were holding up Rachel Carson's little green book, because they had much the same philosophy. The belief was capitalism did not care about the planet, and lots of these kids, it was just a simple flip from them, from marching for Chairman Mao to marching for the Greens. That was the origin of the environmental movement, that whole period. And this also brought about the birth of what was called Earth Day. The first Earth Day was held on April 22nd, 1970, Earth Day 1. Coincidentally or not, that happens to be Lenin's birthday. And I knew lots of the young kids who were marching at that time, and they thought that was funny. They thought that was a joke. They thought that was an in-your-face kind of thing, because that fit in with their whole philosophy that we'd celebrate Earth Day on Lenin's birthday because we knew it was capitalism that was destroying the environment.
So building on the concerns of prominent environmentalists like Rachel Carson and Janella Meadows, but also by community groups and governments about human consumption of natural resources, we started to see a shift in discussion to the concepts of sustainable development, and sustainability. And that was in the early 1980s. And then in 1987, through the Brundtland Report, which is also called Our Common Future, and that's where the Brundtland definition that you were introduced to in topic 1 of the subject comes from. So that really is a sort of simple and memorable definition of what sustainability is. And by 1992, this definition had become widely accepted at a UN conference, which was on the environment, and where 170 nations endorsed a global action plan, which is called Agenda 21 for sustainable economic growth that integrated environmental responsibility. So really starting to see in the early 90s, the roots of the 3 pillars of sustainability coming to the fore. All right, so after that very brief history on environmentalism and sustainability, we'd like you to have a go at this quiz to test your basic knowledge about environmental issues. Now let's turn our attention to the second topic, ILO, which relates to the 10 major natural environmental issues. In the previous Tyler, we discussed sustainability and environmentalism. And in this particular Tyler, we'll discuss some of the evidence of environmental problems and highlight some resources that might be useful for learning about the kinds of problems that we see in the natural environment. We all know that the world, as the natural environment as we know it now, is really quite different to what it was when our grandparents were around, or great-grandparents, and the many generations before that. So such environmental change is quite complex and typically has multiple and interrelated causes. So there's been extensive research that actually documents these changes. For example, a series of UN environmental audits since the 1990s has been undertaken. It's called the Global Environmental Outlook Series. And from this research, we've found unprecedented global environmental problems. So the Global Environmental Outlook reports, they're conducted by expert groups with the cooperation of over 100 governments around the world, and are subject to 2 rounds of peer review, which means that they're pretty scientifically robust studies. And these reports actually assess 4 key indicators of environmental health, which are land, water, atmosphere, and biodiversity. But ultimately, you know, these reports, what they do is paint a disturbing picture, which show that there are multiple indicators of environmental vulnerability. I'm now going to play you a brief video of the findings from the latest GEO report, which is GEO 6, which gives you an overview of the damage to the natural environment on a global scale. Now, if we were to consider one particular issue that's gained a lot of attention recently, and also one that is a useful illustration of the scale and urgency of human-caused environmental change, that has to do with pollution of our oceans with plastics. Across the oceans on Earth, millions of tons of plastic pollution has accumulated over time, because we know plastic takes a really long time to break down, so it stays in the ocean for very long. So for decades, these millions of tons of plastics have flown into the ocean through rivers or through shipping, and they don't biodegrade. Instead, they accumulate and are having these significant impacts, particularly on marine life and our coastlines. So ocean currents carry plastic pollution for very, very far distances, and they swirl in this circular pattern called gyres. I don't know how to pronounce it, but and so what we've seen is that the North Pacific gyre has accumulated approximately 3.5 million tons of human-made plastics. So really a massive scale. I think it's the size of France from what the research tells us. That's how big this great ocean garbage patch, I think it's called, plastic patch is. So a particular concern here is that these plastics are eaten by fish species and seabirds, and other sea animals become entangled in all of this plastic debris. So these plastics absorb and release toxins in the ocean, and when sea animals eat them, the toxins bioaccumulate in the food chain. So, you know, you've probably read it elsewhere that the fish that we end up consuming, being on top of the food chain, you know, it shows high levels of these toxins in that particular seafood. So have a look at this little case study. I'll play you the video in just a second so you can learn more about this one particular environmental issue. Okay, so now in your prescribed reading for this topic, which is the Carroll and Buchholz chapter, which is called Sustainability in the Natural Environment, they highlight 10 major environmental issues. So even though we've covered some already, this is a nice sort of comprehensive list of 10 significant issues. So, and they also echo the findings of the GEO6 report and other research. So these issues include things like ocean pollution, deforestation, energy use, water scarcity, pollution, etc. The final environmental issue of concern is that of climate change. And you'll notice it's actually on top of that list. So climate change is caused overwhelmingly by human use of fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution, and it represents a very complex sustainability challenge for humanity. So to gain a better understanding of climate change and its origins, I want to play you again another video called Climate Science, What You Need to Know. And this covers the basics of climate change. And it's really important that you get your head around those basics.
Let's not beat around the rapidly melting iceberg here. Climate change is happening, and we are causing it. The evidence is overwhelming. Scientists usually reserve this level of agreement for claims like Earth is a planet or air is real. Yet here we are. The climate change ship has now left the dock, yet lots of people on shore are still debating whether boats can actually float. But maybe you're a person who trusts and accepts what climate scientists are telling us. It's just, sometimes it's hard to explain why. I mean, we've all been there. I mean, I care about the environment. I figure with the polar bears and everything, we might as well try electric cars. What do we have to lose? And then they go caps lock serious, saying they have proof that climate change is a hoax perpetuated by scientists paid off by the polar bear lobby as part of a plan to install Al Gore as Supreme World Polar Bear Emperor. Wake up, sheeple. To To keep that from happening, we put together this handy reference. The sun is the source of warmth on Earth, so thanks for that, sun. Ice and clouds reflect some of its light away, but the rest is absorbed by land and water and re-emitted as heat. Some of that heat escapes to space, and some is held in by the atmospheric greenhouse effect. The insulating effect of Earth's greenhouse gases are the reason that life exists as we know it, but human activities have increased the concentration of one of them, carbon dioxide, 40% since the Industrial Revolution. We know the sun's output has varied during history, but since the 1970s, the period when global temperatures increased the fastest, temperature and solar activity have moved in opposite directions. If the sun was to blame, it would cook the upper and lower layers of the atmosphere together. Instead, we only see warming in the lower layers, the same place that human greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide are piling up. Since 1870, with fossil fuels, cement production, and land use combined, humans have put about 2,000 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. That's 2 million tons, and about 40% has stayed there. Studying gases trapped in ice cores has let us see what Earth's atmosphere was like in the past. At more than 400 parts per million, today's carbon dioxide levels are the highest they've been for almost a million years. That's before humans even existed. Totally uncharted territory for us. More carbon dioxide in the atmosphere means average temperatures across the globe are increasing, and fast. Right now, Earth is warming about 10 times faster than at the end of an ice age. Okay, so CO2 is increasing. How do we know it's our fault? The best evidence comes from looking at what isotopes, or different kinds of carbon, are in the atmosphere. Fossil fuels come mainly from old plants. Plants prefer to use the lighter isotope carbon-12 over the heavier carbon-13, so they contain a higher ratio of 12 to 13 than the atmosphere does. When more fossil fuels get burned, the percentage of carbon-12 in the atmosphere should go up, and that's exactly what we see. And it's not because of volcanic activity. Volcanoes only emit about 1% as much CO2 as we do. Normally that CO2 is balanced in exchange between the atmosphere, plants, and animals, but eliminating carbon sinks has released centuries worth in just a few years. Other greenhouse gases are also increasing, like methane from farm animals and natural gas processing, or nitrous oxide from fertilizers. If we run simulations just using natural causes of climate change, they predict no change or even cooling in the 20th century, and that is not what's happening. It's still going to get cold in some places, but in the 2000s, there were twice as many record highs as record lows. And each of the past 3 decades has been warmer than any other decade since we started measuring in 1850. Since 1900, actual temperatures around the world have increased almost a full degree, and most of that has happened since the 1970s. Looking at data from tree rings and ice cores, the past 30 years is probably the warmest in 8 centuries. Of course, not every place on Earth warms equally. Oceans cover more than 70% of Earth, and they absorb more than 90% of the heat added to the planet. Naturally, that's where we see the most extreme changes. Around the world, oceans are rising 1/10 of an inch per year, and they're up 8 inches since 1901. This is because water expands as it warms. And when ice sheets and glaciers melt in Greenland and Antarctica, water that's normally on frozen land gets put in the ocean. The oceans are Earth's largest carbon sink. As more CO2 enters the atmosphere, more of it dissolves in the ocean, which makes the water more acidic. This doesn't mean the oceans will be made of acid, but animals with calcium shells are super sensitive to pH. We're on course for the oceans to hit pH 7.8 in 100 years, which could wipe out 1/3 of species in the ocean. We also know that levels of summer sea ice in the Arctic have decreased 40% since 1978. They might be the lowest levels in 1,400 years. That white sea ice usually reflects the sun's energy back into the atmosphere, but the dark ocean is soaking it up like a black shirt on a sunny day, which feeds the cycle forward. If CO2 emissions continue on their current trends, Earth is on course to be 2.5 to 5 degrees warmer. The oceans could be up to 1 meter higher by the end of this century. Is that a big deal? Yeah, it's the biggest deal. This is by far the greatest issue facing our species. The last time the Earth averaged a few degrees colder, most of North America was covered in a mile-thick sheet of ice. That many degrees warmer? We're gonna have a bad time. So now you're armed with the facts, why we know climate change is happening and why we're causing it. Please share this information with the people you know, and then let me know. Did it change any minds? Did it change your mind? I mean, are facts enough? If not, then why do so many people continue to not believe in climate science? We'll answer that question in our next video. Stay curious.
Okay, so on that note about climate change, the review and reflect on this section is an exercise that I undertook not too long ago, and I thought it was really interesting and I wanted to share it with you. So in case you ever wanted to know what the most effective ways to tackle climate change are, I'd like you to take this quiz, and I think, like me, you might find that the answers will surprise you. So for the next, Tyler, we turn our attention to the NIMBY problem. One of the really interesting features of environmental problems is the attitude that's called "not in my backyard," and it's often referred to by its acronym NIMBY. This attitude has also been, it's sometimes referred to as the NIMBY principle. And it has many examples. One common one is that a community might welcome the benefits of, say, oil exploration and oil refining, such as, having a lot of oil for transportation, manufacturing, and heating, but then they fiercely oppose any proposal to build an oil refinery or undertake oil exploration in their own neighborhood. In other words, we accept the benefits, but refuse to take responsibility for coping with the challenges that come with those benefits. Because very often there are pros and cons with any such kind of investment, right? So you can't just accept the good and not the bad. But yet this kind of psychological attitude that people have, or NIMBY, shows us that, on the trade-off, people aren't willing, to accept difficult trade-offs. Another variation or example of the NIMBY attitude is where individuals or organizations receive the benefits that come with the use of natural resources, such as the profits, but they refuse to take responsibility for addressing the environmental damage and pollution that's associated with gaining access to those resources. So examples of this NIMBY attitude include some resource companies and companies that use natural or refined resources, such as airlines or logistics companies. So that externality that they produce from engaging in these activities through, producing oil or other fossil fuels, the kind of social and environmental damage that comes with it is not something that they take into account as much. But we are starting to see, as more and more companies embrace sustainability, that they are accounting for those externalities and are starting to address the NIMBY problem. Another example of a NIMBY attitude is where there are people who are worried about the environment. So it's not, the NIMBY isn't limited to large businesses who want to exploit the environment but don't want to pay for it. The converse is also true. So if people are concerned about carbon pollution or the environment, but they also don't want a wind farm in their backyard because of the noise, or they feel that it causes cancer, or whatever reason, they're against installing wind farms. So this is really quite puzzling, as you can tell, because you want the benefit of cleaner energy, but you don't want the eyesore or the problems that come with generating it. And nuclear energy is another classic example of a NIMBY problem. We don't want to pay as much for electricity, but we also don't want the risk of having nuclear in our backyard. So, understanding trade-offs again becomes really important. Now, for the review and reflect related to NIMBY, one of the things that becomes quite clear is when you think about a particular project. So in this case, an incinerator, which will convert garbage waste to energy. When you have large-scale projects like this, there are a number of different stakeholders. So you have the homeowners, right, who produce the waste, but also because it's in a local city, they might also be living close to the incinerator. You have local business owners, you have the waste management employees, and then you have, say, the local public health manager. So depending on, if you assume any one of these roles, you can see that each one of these people will have different arguments for or against the construction of the incinerator. So what I'd like you to do is to wear the hat of each of these roles and think about any potential NIMBY attitudes that might arise from one of these particular stakeholders. Now let's consider the fourth and final topic, ILO, for the environmental system, and that's the role that business and government play in environmental issues. So if you look at all these organizations on this slide, what do you think the one thing is that they have in common? You'll notice that they represent a cross-section of sectors, you know, from sporting organizations to intergovernmental organizations to economic unions to banks. So really a cross-section. And the answer is quite simple. They all have an interest and a desire for environmental sustainability. So you'll be really hard-pressed today to find a business or an organization that isn't concerned about environmental sustainability. Most organizations recognize the importance. So, you know, to answer the question that the Tyler poses, what role does business play and government play? They play a very significant role. So starting off with the role of governments and environmental issues, the concept of sustainability more broadly is increasingly important for governments around the world. So this is evident at the United Nations, who represent obviously many, many countries in the world. And they declared the period from 2005 to 2014 as the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. So member nations of the OECD as well, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, England, and Germany, are just some of the countries who've developed national policies for sustainable development. For governments, we see its influence in the form of recently evolved institutions, also globally, whose purpose is to preserve aspects of the environment, and these include things like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations Environmental Protection Agency, who recently reached an agreement on limiting plastic pollution globally. So, you know, they're important government bodies, intergovernmental bodies that, and the important thing about these intergovernmental organizations is they recognize the wickedness of a lot of these environmental problems. And they know you can't fix the plastic pollution issue in Asia or in Latin America. You know, you need a kind of global coordinated approach to addressing these problems. You also have global frameworks like the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then, you know, as in another effort, another way to tackle climate change, you have the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, which is a market mechanism set up to trade in carbon credits. Now, if we were to think about the Australian context specifically, there are some examples here as well of government legislation that really strives to preserve and protect the natural environment. And some of this legislation includes the Clean Energy Act of 2011, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999, and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act. So, you know, different purposes, but the legislation really allows the enforcing of this protection. It's not enough just to say, oh, we care about the environment. You know, having legislation really gives, you know, it gives strength and it gives that ability, as I said, to enforce a particular direction that you want to go in. So just as the environment is so important for governments, it's also really important for businesses, because if there's one thing you'd have learned in this subject is the importance of having kind of a systems approach where all these different stakeholders and interested parties play a role in addressing sustainability issues. So we need to see more and more efforts by business to increase the stewardship of natural resources. So stewardship by definition means a steward is someone who's a caretaker. So, we have this responsibility to take care of the natural environment and be stewards. So, there's a need to increase stewardship. Also, businesses should strive to implement innovative solutions and contribute overall to sustainable development. So the UN Global Compact has an environmental stewardship strategy for corporate leaders, and they identify 4 key responsibilities for business in this area. Firstly, to embed environmental stewardship into all facets of the organization, so top down throughout the organization, creating awareness and education for the need for that particular business to care about the environment, to recognize how they impact and are impacted by their natural environment. There's also a need to balance short-term targets and long-term goals that are both critical to performance and environmental stewardship. So typically what tends to happen is businesses are concerned with year-on-year profitability, but very often when you make an investment, say, in reducing the amount of plastic in the ocean, that's not going to happen overnight. So it's creating that balance and understanding that financial short-term targets and long-term goals can sometimes not be aligned. It's also important for businesses to diffuse best practice throughout the value chains and business networks by working with stakeholders. The most obvious example here is working with suppliers. So, if you have the best environmental practices, reduce your emissions, your carbon emissions, you could be ticking all the green boxes, but if your suppliers don't do that, and if that doesn't happen down the supply chain, so with the distribution and your consumption of your product, then your best laid plans are really gone to waste because you haven't looked at it from a whole life cycle point of view. And finally, it's important for businesses to translate best practice into practices and processes that they operate in across the world. So with large multinational companies, historically, unfortunately, what we've seen is large multinationals, they won't pollute at home in their home country, but they are happy to kind of export the waste problem to somewhere else where they manufacture the product. So environmental stewardship requires you to take a global approach where you treat all geographies the same. So it's not okay to pollute in a country that has poor governance and poor laws, and then not pollute in your home country. If you should aim not to pollute anywhere in the world. Okay, so I'm now going to go through some detailed examples of this 4-pillar strategy from the UN Global Compact in its environmental stewardship strategy. So starting with embed, an example there is that of Nokia. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember Nokia phones, but Nokia still exists, but mostly in the sort of technology and the telecoms infrastructure space. But with Nokia, ethical and environmental elements are now included within the entire supply chain management processes. So everything from supplier selection and contracting, how they assess their suppliers, how they manage the relationship with their suppliers. So they conduct over 100 supplier assessments every year. And those that don't meet Nokia's requirements must provide and commit to implementive corrective action. Another example of how a company embeds environmental stewardship is Holcim, which is a Swedish concrete company. So they have a sustainable environmental performance committee, so a special committee of the board that drives environmental strategy and role in the global industry and their community. You'll find a lot of companies that embed sustainability also play a key role in being sort of advocates for sustainability in their industry and among their competitors as well. Now, as I mentioned with balance, it doesn't only consider short-term shareholders' financial interests, but also longer-term environmental interests of other stakeholders. So those include local and international communities, as well as future generations. So a really hard balance to reach, actually, but still very important when you have these competing priorities. An example of a company that approaches balance well is Tata, which is an Indian conglomerate. And so all Tata companies, they scan their sustainability challenges on the horizon, so opportunities and threats, and they examine patterns in the external environment. And then based on whatever information they collect about future threats and opportunities, they actually send that information to their senior leadership, and they can then be in a position to make adjustments and corrections and work with key stakeholders. So if, for example, they've identified a threat based on their water usage, or if there's a drought, that information is really important to be fed to senior leadership so they can adjust their strategy based on that. So having that balance between, well, how do we preserve future interests with current competing financial priorities? Now, when it comes to diffusion of practices, so the Nokia one that I highlighted earlier is also important in how they diffuse it throughout the company. And Westpac, which is an Australian bank, they do a lot of work engaging their local communities and different stakeholders through active engagement. So they have actually developed systems to take feedback from these different stakeholder groups, including the government, consumers, and NGOs. So they absorb that information and it's disseminated throughout the organization. And then finally, when it comes to translating, so leader companies in this space, they achieve compliance as well as sustainability outcomes that meet and exceed the laws and regulations in each market that they operate. So these leading companies also go beyond the use of, say, one certification standard, and they take really different approaches and protocols to elevate their standards of performance. So unfortunately, sustainability is still seen as a tick box exercise for a lot of companies. So they'll do the bare minimum to meet the compliance standards, which is why we've seen a situation, as I mentioned earlier, where companies operate in countries that have poor governance or very relaxed laws, and they can then be exploited. So we find that leader companies actually always go beyond that. An example of that is Novo Nordisk. And they basically, they came to believe that standard financial reports, they capture less than 20% of corporate risks and value creation potential. So the company really goes way beyond just the financial reports in terms of standardizing and translating what they do in one market into other markets as well. So they use tools like integrated reporting. They use tools like, the sustainability reports and non-financial information as a way to try and maximize the impact that they have and to minimize the harm in all the markets that they operate in. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this topic, ILO, and for this topic overall. So for the final review and reflect on the role of business in addressing environmental challenges, I would like you to read these two mini case studies on IKEA and Aon. And these are examples of how some really large global businesses are leading the transition to renewable energy. And in that we're reducing their carbon emissions. So really two practical examples of how this is being done by actual organizations. Right, so that brings us to the end of this week's topic. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the environmental system. I know there's been a lot to absorb, so take your time to review this week's materials, go slowly, read the case studies, do the activities, do the same for next week, and just keep an eye out for any assessments that might be due either this week or coming up, and slowly keep chipping away at all of those. Thank you for taking the time to watch this.